Welcome to From Betrayal to Breakthrough. I'm Dr. Debi Silber, and in today's episode, we're tackling a powerful topic that's come up again and again in conversations with PBT members, PBT coaches, and even in my own life, enabling. What happens when we protect others from the very pain that could lead to their growth? And what does it cost us in the process? We're going to talk about it. Here we go. Hi there. So I want to talk about something that usually I bring up topics that I have, been coming across in my recent conversations with members within the PBT Institute, with even people that we certify, situations and scenarios that seem to be coming up. There always seems to be a theme. Well, the theme I've been seeing is something that I realized we haven't really had a full episode on. So I think it's worth it. And what I want to talk about today is enabling. And when I talk about enabling, I'm really talking about when we are allowing something to continue that's preventing us from getting the support, the treatment, the trust, the everything that we need. Like, for example, you're listening to this show because most likely you've been betrayed. So let's take an example of a betrayer, and because of whatever their issue is, we're trying to work around it. We're trying to kind of move forward with it still being a part of what's going on. It hasn't been truly resolved. There's been no crash and burn of the old, so there's no rebirthing of the new. But let's face it, here we are, we're afraid of the consequences. Maybe it's because, and remember in my study, I always talk about, and if you haven't heard it, I talk about the three groups who did not heal. There was one group where they were numbing, avoiding, distracting, right? They ran to the doctor who put them on a mood stabilizer or an anti-anxiety. They gave them an anti-anxiety medication, or they were emotionally eating or drinking or numbing in front of the TV, whatever it was. It may have made the day a bit easier to get through, not without a price. They did not heal. The second group, this was the group, they had their story, they were sticking with it. The story of their betrayal and all it gave them, and who, what happened and all of that, was something that became so familiar they couldn't imagine life without that story. They didn't heal. And I've heard this over and over. There have been so many people who come into the PBT Institute and they meet with me to see if, we're a fit to work together. And I can tell when the story is so well rehearsed. I've heard, it just sounds it from how many times they shared that same story. They don't heal. The third group, this was the group where the betrayer had very little consequences. So whether it was out of financial fear, not wanting to break up a family, religious reasons, whatever it was, I actually saw two things with this group. Number one, a further deterioration of the relationship. And two, this group they had the most symptoms of post-betrayal syndrome. They were the most sick. They had the most symptoms of the physical, mental, and emotional symptoms. And it's because your broken heart can't take that. But they just did all they could to turn the other cheek, look the other way. And very often, and everybody has their reasons why why they're tolerating, why they're not doing something about it. And I'm not here to judge or say what's right and wrong, because someone spoke with me just yesterday and she said, my partner is betraying, but he's neurodivergent. So what do I do? Right? So now here are the scenarios where we can we put better boundaries in place? Can we be more explicit about what we're willing or unwilling to tolerate? But let's just take a betrayal that maybe you have been through, where there really isn't a consequence. And because of that, the betrayer isn't feeling the deep, profound impact of the trauma they have caused. And you're not getting the profound healing of this entire relationship as it was is no longer. And I use the analogy of a house a lot, where when you take an old house and let's say you just keep patching it up and patching it up and patching it up, thinking that that's just going to do the job. And on some level, in the beginning, it kind of, if that's what feels like, well, this is patching it up and I can still go about my day and do my thing. Okay. And that's resilience, where you're restoring, bringing it back to some level. But with real trauma and transformation, it's more like a tornado comes by and levels the house. So the patching it up isn't going to fix it, right? So what happens is at that level, and I did 2 TEDx talks, I mentioned this house story in one of them. You can stand at the lot where your house once stood and say, oh my gosh, this is the most horrible, terrible, awful thing that's ever happened. And you'd be right. And you can call all your friends over and say, look at this. Isn't this the most terrible, horrible, awful thing you've ever seen? And they would agree. And you can mourn the loss of your house for the remainder of your days. No one can fault you for it. However, if you choose to rebuild the house, you don't have to. But if you choose to, why in the world would you build the same one? There's nothing there. Why not give it everything the old house didn't have? If you notice, the old house didn't have, wasn't facing the sun at the right time of day, like, right? Change it. Or if it didn't have the closets that you wanted, whatever it is for you, enough windows, whatever, you change it. And the whole idea is, when we enable, we're not allowing for the crash and burn, so that we can rebuild from the ground up. Whether you rebuild a new version of you based now on who are you ready to become? What do you want? What do you need? What were you settling for? What were you tolerating? What have you outgrown? You see, when we crash and burn, we have access to all these questions, where now we can say, you know what? I didn't like that the old me really didn't stand up for my needs. I don't like that I settled. I don't like that I didn't listen to my wise inner guide, right? All of those things. And now you could say, this new version of me that I'm intentionally and deliberately creating is going to listen. If I'm asked to do something that truly doesn't feel like a fit, I'm going to stand up for myself and I'm going to say no. If I don't want something, I'm going to say no. If I need something, if something's important to me, I'm going to speak up and I'm going to make sure this is included in the plan somehow, right? You see, so that's the benefit of the crash and burn if you're the betrayed. Now, for the betrayer, if they don't get the depth of pain and destruction they've caused, then maybe they don't get it. Maybe they don't have a real sense of empathy, because maybe they haven't had to. And I'm not suggesting any of this is your fault. Let's be never in a second. There's not 1 second that betrayal is ever your fault. It is someone's choice. Always, always. Do they have unresolved trauma and entitlement issues and whatever it was that led them to these choices? Yes. And does that need to be dealt with and managed and healed? Yes. But does that excuse betrayal? Never, ever, ever, ever. So now let's just say the betrayer really doesn't have those deep consequences. Maybe there's a little slap on the wrist, or maybe there's just this, okay, whatever. And because the betrayed, especially, the more it happens, the more worn down you get, the less you believe in yourself, the physically you're feeling horrible, because you have more and more and more symptoms of post-betrayal syndrome. So here's what's going on both ends. You're managing and suppressing symptoms of post-betrayal syndrome, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. So you're depleted, spent, hurting on so many levels, and you don't have the strength you need to step up and stand up for yourself and say no and all these things. So the wearing down, it's like water on a rock. You're getting worn down more and more and more and more. So now, on the other hand, on the betrayer's side, they don't have that deep, deep, profound impact of what their betrayal has created. So without that, now it's like, okay, well, slap on the wrist, I could tolerate that. And then more of the same. So then what happens is the betrayer doesn't really have that felt experience of, I just shattered the heart and the trust of the very person or the very people I love and trust the most, that love and trust me the most. And they don't. So without that crash and burn, they don't wake up. On the betrayed side, we're just dealing with reeling from the most recent experience, trying to regroup ourselves enough what, to just stand up and gather our thoughts and ourselves so that it can happen again? Do you see what's happening here? So the enabling is what's so destructive to both, to the betrayer and the betrayed. And I know many of you are thinking, why in the world am I interested in doing anything to help the betrayer? Well, because think about it, not that you have to do anything with it, but when the betrayer crashes and burns, and now they are cracked wide open, they can have the same insight, awareness, transformative potential that you have. And I'm not saying this just from theory here. I work with our rebuild members. Those are the betrayers. And I see it every time I have a call with them. These are people who are ready to become someone they're proud of. Not that you need to do anything with it if this is your partner, but there's tremendous potential. And I speak with these betrayers, and they're so committed. They're so committed to removing themselves from any version of their old self. If the old self was argumentative and defensive and didn't take responsibility, this version of themselves that they're growing into does. And they're looking at their past behavior, and there's so much regret and remorse and shame. And we do a lot of work with shame, because shame is the most debilitating emotion of all. When we take the shame and do something constructive with it, that's powerful. But if the betrayer is just sitting there in a pile of shame, that's not helping them. It's not helping the betrayer. It's not helping anybody. So there's so much that goes on when the betrayer rebuilds. But that's what happens when there's no enabling, when they crash and burn. Now, as a mom of 4, and for those of you who are parents, we try to, and I remember the days where you of course, you want to prevent your kids from any sort of pain, any sort of problem, any sort of anything. But think about it. Think back to your experience, and think back to, if you have children, where you knew something was going to go down, hopefully not really harmful, but may have gotten them into a bit of a pickle, and you tried to save them, and then you were like, you know what? They have to learn a lesson, and I'm not going to save them anymore. And it was so hard, and it was so painful, but you sort of step back, and lesson learned. I remember, it's such a silly example, but it was one of my kids, and they had violin or viola, one of those, every Monday. And I would say every Sunday night, leave that viola by the door so you don't have to, so you're sure to bring it. And sure enough, they would forget. And then I would get the call, and I would have to run it to school. And I would do that over and over and over again. And then finally I realized I'm enabling. The lesson isn't going to be learned. And so there was that Sunday night that came along. Don't forget to leave your viola by the door, your violin by the door. And sure enough, Monday came, and child went to school, and I got the call, and I did not bring the viola. No, I was torturing myself. Do I do it? Do I not? Did they get in trouble? Yes. But did they ever forget it after that? No. So what I want you to do is think about the times where you enabled someone else. And because of that, it prevented them from the lessons that they needed to learn. Now, listen, this is hard stuff. And we're doing it because we don't want to see someone in pain. We see them struggling. We give them the benefit of the doubt. We believe in them. So it's all coming from such a beautiful place. But if you're dealing with someone who maybe your partner is an addict of some kind, and then it's the same thing where it's like, okay, well, let's not do it again. And there's no, consequence there. Well, it keeps happening again. I've heard so many stories of parents where their children they get into trouble with drugs or with alcohol, with something. And there's that moment where they say, I can't get them. I can't prevent them from themselves and from the train wreck they're headed for. And then usually it's terrifying. And then who knows after that? Sometimes I've heard so many amazing stories of the wake up, the big shake up and the wake up that followed. So if you don't know it's possible for anybody else, check yourself. Think about how you learned some of your greatest lessons. They weren't learned because you had it easy. They were learned because you learned the hard way, because you had to pick up your own pieces. You had to take responsibility for the choices that you made. You had to, you made the bed, now you got to lie in it, that old saying. And it's the same thing here. Reflect on,